Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The sun was already beginning to dip behind the tired rooftops of Yumu's village when Mama Ebra trudged past the market's edge with a plastic bowl in her hands and nothing inside. She had spent the entire afternoon begging for leftover vegetables from hawkers who either ignored her or scolded her for always coming empty-handed. Her wrapper was dusty, her slippers worn flat, and her face, a mixture of sunburn and fatigue, bore the story of a woman fighting to breathe in a world determined to choke her. As she turned into the narrow path beside the refuse dump, she heard it, faint, soft, and trembling. At first, she thought it was a kitten, but when she stepped closer, her heart sank. Two babies, wrapped in bloodied cloth, lay abandoned beside the flies and broken bottles. One was barely moving, the other's cry was growing weaker by the second. Her legs shook. She dropped the bowl and fell to her knees. Jesus, Jesus. Chinique, oh God, she whispered over and over, tears springing to her eyes. The babies were newborns no more than a day old. The umbilical cords had been cut with something jagged. Flies buzzed around them, but they were alive. Ebra picked them up slowly, one after the other, placing them against her chest with trembling arms. The girls whimpered and wriggled weakly. A rag fell off one of them, revealing a tiny wrist with a faint bruise, perhaps where someone had tried to bind her. Ebra looked around, heart pounding, half expecting someone to run up and claim them, but no one came. Just chickens picking trash, the distant honk of a kiki, and the wind. Her chest ached, not from fear, but from recognition, a painful, almost spiritual understanding that these children were as forgotten by the world as she had once been. She stood up, shielding them from the sun, and whispered shakily, "You may not have come from me, but you're mine now." And just like that, a woman who could barely feed herself became a mother of two. She didn't think about how she would buy pap, or if the landlord would scream at her for crying babies. She didn't ask if they would survive or if people would laugh at her again. Her only thought was shelter, warmth, life. As she made her way home, her back hunched slightly from exhaustion. Some people turned to stare. One trader murmured, "Ebra don't carry another walla again." Another shouted, "You want die on top children way no be your own?" But Ebra kept walking. Her eyes stayed on the path. Her arms never loosened. And the twins, sensing something they didn't yet understand, slowly stopped crying. Many years ago, Mama Ebra had a name that wasn't drenched in pity. Back then, she was simply Ebra Nwakigo, the village beauty with soft skin and a laugh like a river. Her wedding to Obinna was small but joyous. They had danced under the mango tree in her late father's compound, her cheeks glowing with love and promise. Obinna, with his sweet tongue and smooth hands, had sworn to protect her. "Whether child or no child," he said, "I chose you, Ebra. You're enough." She believed him. She cooked for him, massaged his feet after work, and waited every month for signs that her womb had opened. Each time her period came, she swallowed the disappointment with silence. She didn't want to be the nagging wife. She wanted to be the woman he loved, the one who would someday hold their baby in her arms and say, "Look, love, look what we made." But months became years, and whispers began to thicken like smoke. Her neighbors, once warm, began to fold their arms when she passed. Her mother-in-law grew distant, always inviting prophets and herbalists without asking Ebra first. "She's a dry pot," someone once said behind her back, but she heard it. Obinna still smiled at her in public, but in the bedroom, he grew quiet, distant, cold. She found strange herbs hidden beneath his bed and lipstick stains on his singlets. He started sleeping at overnight vigils that she knew were lies. Still, she stayed. She washed his clothes and prayed at midnight. She even drank a concoction that gave her ulcers. All she wanted was one baby, one child to anchor her marriage, one reason to stay. Then came the worst blow. One morning, a young girl named Ngozi showed up, 6 months pregnant, standing in the living room like she owned it. Obinna didn't deny it. He simply said, "She's carrying what you couldn't give me." The shame tore through Ebra like lightning. In front of his family, he mocked her, said he'd wasted 7 years on an empty womb. His mother clapped in agreement. "A man must plant where it will grow," they chanted. That night, he told her to sleep outside because Ngozi needed the bed. And the next morning, he packed her things in a gonna-must-go bag and left them at the door. "Go back to your people," he said, without looking her in the eyes. But she had no people left. Her parents were gone. Her siblings had married far away. So, she picked up the bag, her pride shattered, her stomach empty, and walked into the unknown. The journey back to her father's abandoned compound felt like exile. Overgrown weeds had swallowed the entrance. The windows were broken, and the roof had holes like a sieve. Inside, termites had eaten through the old table where she once sat to eat with her parents. She dropped her bag on the dusty floor and sat silently, the walls staring back at her like old friends who didn't know how to comfort her. For 3 days she didn't eat, just drank water from the clay pot and cried. Not because of Obina, but because of the weight of rejection. She had given her all, her body, her time, her heart, only to be told she was less than a woman. The silence of the house became her companion, and every sound outside reminded her of the life she had lost. Laughter from neighbors. Children calling their mothers. It stabbed her heart. But Ebra didn't die. She rose again, slowly. One morning, she tied her headscarf, swept the compound, and told herself, "I will live, even if I have nothing." She began offering to help people with chores, fetching water, splitting firewood, washing clothes. Some paid her in coins, others in leftover food. She took it all with gratitude. When she had a little money, she bought roasted corn and saved the cob to boil for flavoring soup. People gossiped. "See how the mighty has fallen." But she never answered them. She walked with her shoulders back, even if her stomach was empty. The worst day came when she went to a family to beg for used clothes, and they made her wash their toilet first. She did it. Quietly. She needed something to survive the next day. Still, something in her refused to give up. She kept going. She kept living. And as time passed, she no longer waited for a man or for a child. She stopped counting her periods. She stopped listening to sermons that promised wombs would open. Instead, she focused on survival. Until that hot afternoon when she found the babies, a reminder that sometimes God doesn't give you what you ask for. He gives you what you need. Ebra would never forget the day she saw the girl with the belly, round, firm, and undeniably carrying Obina's child, standing in her sitting room like a long-lost guest. The girl, barely out of her teenage years, had a smug smile on her face, chewing gum as if mocking every heartbeat in Ebra's chest. Obina walked in behind her, carrying 2 sachets of pure water and a nylon bag of tomatoes, as if nothing were wrong. When Ebra asked what was happening, Obina didn't even flinch. "This isn't Ngozi," he said casually. "She's staying here now. She's carrying my child." It was like swallowing broken glass. Her knees buckled, and she had to grip the wall for balance, but no one moved to help her. Instead, Ngozi dragged her slippers off and walked straight into the bedroom that used to be theirs. In that moment, something in Ebra died quietly. In the days that followed, Ebra lived as a stranger in her own home. She cooked meals that Ngozi rejected and cleaned floors only to be mocked. Obina avoided eye contact and barely spoke to her unless it was to criticize something. One night, as she lay awake listening to Ngozi's giggles from their bedroom, she heard Obina say loudly, "I wasted too many years on that empty womb." Ebra's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't make a sound. The next morning, she tried to speak to him, to remind him of the love they once shared, of the promises he made on their wedding day, but he waved her off like a fly. "You are like a well that produces no water," he hissed. "You bring me shame." And that evening, in front of his mother and 3 village elders, he announced that he was sending her away. "She's cursed," he said, "and I won't let her bad luck infect my child."
When she tried to pack her clothes, Ngozi smirked and threw one of her wrappers on the ground. "You go need this for begging," she said. Ebra didn't respond. She just knelt slowly, picked up the wrapper, and folded it. Obina stood at the door holding a small gonna-must-go bag filled with her belongings, wrapper, 2 blouses, and her late father's Bible. She stepped out without looking back, her feet bare, her dignity in shreds. The sky was dark, and the wind blew dust into her face, but she didn't stop walking. Every house she passed seemed to whisper her shame. She couldn't give him a child. She has been replaced. But no one knew that her womb wasn't what was empty. It was the heart of the man she had once called husband. The road to her late father's compound was long, silent, and cruel. With each step, Ebra felt like she was walking deeper into a grave of forgotten dreams. The house stood at the edge of the village, surrounded by weeds and memories. Its rusted zinc roof had holes, and the wooden door was swollen from years of rain. She stood in front of it for minutes, unable to move, staring at the home that once held her childhood laughter and her father's bedtime stories. Now it looked haunted by sorrow, a mirror of her own soul. She pushed the door open and walked inside. Dust danced in the air, and the floor creaked under her weight. She set her bag down in a corner, sat on the cracked floor, and hugged herself tightly. And then, without warning, she broke down, not just crying, but weeping from the depths of her soul, the way only a woman who has lost everything can. For the next few days, Ebra did not leave the compound. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but she ignored it. Her eyes were swollen, her lips dry, and her spirit threadbare. She remembered her mother's voice, soft and firm, saying, "Life will always test your knees, my daughter. Bend, but do not break." That memory became her anchor. Slowly, she began to clean the house, sweeping out dust, chasing out lizards, and patching holes in the roof with old sacks. She tied her wrapper tighter and told herself she would survive. On the 4th day, she left the compound and approached a nearby house to ask if they had clothes she could wash for a few coins. The woman looked her up and down and said, "You? Wash my clothes." But she agreed. And just like that, Ebra began building her new life. One insult, one coin, one meal at a time. She became the woman who did all the jobs no one else wanted. Cleaning pit toilets, fetching water for nursing mothers, carrying firewood from the bush. People mocked her. She used to walk like a queen. Now she crawls like a rat. But Ebra never answered. Her pride had been buried the day Obina called her useless. All that mattered now was staying alive. She learned to make soup out of leaves and salt. She saved broken slippers and stitched them with thread. She slept on mats woven with holes and used old curtains as blankets. She prayed at night not for a miracle, but for strength to face another day. And slowly, her silence became her armor. She had no child, no family, and no hope, but she was still breathing. And to her, that meant there was still a reason to keep going. The villagers soon learned that Ebra's silence was not weakness, but endurance in its rawest form. She became a shadow that never faded, always around, always surviving. Each morning, she tied her wrapper, swept her compound with quiet determination, and left to seek work before the sun fully rose. Her favorite spot was under the almond tree beside Mama Ozo's stall, where she would sit and wait for people needing errands done. Some days she earned 50 naira. Some days, nothing. But every night, she returned home with a sigh of relief, knowing she had survived again. She drank Gary with tears in her eyes and warmed her hands by a fire made from picked-up trash. Her skin grew darker from the sun, her fingers calloused, but her eyes stayed gentle. Even the dogs in the village began to recognize her, that thin woman who never shouted, never begged, never stole. Her body ached from labor, but her spirit began to find rhythm in the chaos. She started saving coins in a small calabash beneath the floorboards. She used part of it to buy firewood and resold it in bundles. When someone offered her leftover clothes, she turned them into headscarves for sale. She was poor, but resourceful. Still, people talked. That's the barren one. She washed her womb dry. No man will look her way again. But she no longer felt their arrows. Her heart had grown thick with armor, forged from disappointment. Yet in her most private moments, like when the stars were out and the wind danced through her broken window, she still prayed. Not for Obina to return. Not for a baby. Just for a second chance. For meaning. For something or someone to prove that all her pain had a purpose. And then one hot afternoon, while returning from a rejected job at the school canteen, she heard that sound. The soft cry of the unknown. Near the dump site. Something fragile and trembling. Her legs moved before her mind did. And when she saw them, two newborns, eyes shut, skin red and tender, barely wrapped, she did not flinch. She dropped her firewood, lifted them gently, and pressed them to her chest. No one else came. No one else cared. But Ebra did. Because in that moment, in those babies' cries, she saw herself. Forgotten. Rejected. Unwanted. And yet, somehow, still alive. It was in the stillness of that late afternoon, just before the village returned to its evening chaos, that Mama Ebra made the decision that would change her life forever. She didn't take the babies home because she thought she could be their mother. She took them because something inside her wouldn't let her walk away. The moment she touched their fragile skin, her body remembered every empty night she had spent begging God to give her a child. Her mind recalled every insult, every mocking word that had followed her since Obina threw her out like she was trash. These babies had been left in the very kind of place society had placed her. A dump. She couldn't turn her back on them, because she knew what it felt like to be discarded. They were not just babies, they were her reflection, helpless, cold, and waiting for someone to choose them. When she got home, the babies were already faintly crying again, the hunger in their bellies louder than their tiny voices. Ebra looked around the room, bare, dusty, and barely livable, and felt fear begin to creep in. She had no baby clothes, no feeding bottles, not even enough water stored in her clay pot. But she refused to let panic win. She laid one baby on her worn-out wrapper and strapped the other gently to her back, then set out with the strength of a woman driven not by logic, but by love. She went house to house, begging for old cloth, used feeding bottles, and pap flour. Some people gave, most refused, but the baby's cries softened the hearts of a few mothers. An old widow named Mama Chinyar gave her 2 rubber nipples and some powdered milk. "You no get sense, Ebra," she muttered, shaking her head. "But you get heart." That night, with only a lamp glowing dimly beside her mat, Ebra fed the baby spoon by spoon. They sucked weakly, eyes closed, their breathing uneven but present. She didn't sleep. Every time one whimpered, she stirred, checked them, and whispered songs her mother once sang. She named them silently before dawn broke. Chisholm, meaning God follows me, for the stronger one with a faint birthmark on her chin, and Chinaza, meaning God answers, for the quieter one with the broader forehead. As the roosters crowed and the village came alive again, Ebra looked down at the sleeping babies beside her and allowed herself one rare moment of warmth. She was still poor, still mocked, still broken, but for the first time in years, her room didn't feel empty. The news spread faster than the harmattan wind. By noon, half the village had heard that Mama Ebra, the barren widow, the outcast, had picked up 2 babies from the market dump and brought them home. Some said they were twins of a prostitute who had fled in shame. Others swore they were cursed children left by a madwoman. But what united everyone was the laughter. It came from behind closed doors, around firewood pots, and under mango trees. "She's lost her mind," someone said. "A woman who can't feed herself wants to raise children." Even the pastor's wife scoffed. "That's how desperate she is. She's now borrowing children to pretend she's a mother." No one came to help her. No one offered to bathe the babies or give her a proper blanket. They simply watched from a distance, waiting for her to fail, to return the babies or collapse from hunger. Ebra heard every word, every snicker, every whispered mockery. But she did not flinch. She didn't reply when a woman pointed at her from across the well and shouted, "You want to die for other people's mistakes?" Instead, she fetched her water, strapped one baby on her back, held the other in her arms, and walked away with the dignity of a queen. Inside, though the weight was crushing, the babies cried constantly, their tiny bodies unfamiliar with nourishment. The cloths she used as diapers soaked through within hours. Her small savings disappeared within days, spent on milk, wrappers, and soap. She chewed raw cassava to silence the hunger in her own belly while making pap for the twins. One night, after hours of rocking them to sleep, she sat on the floor and wept silently. Not because of regret, but because of exhaustion. Her body was breaking, but her will refused to surrender. Still, in the midst of ridicule, something strange happened. A few quiet souls began to see her differently. One was Mama Chinyere, who started sending Ebra leftovers wrapped in banana leaves. Another was Adaobi, a young girl who helped her carry water once in a while. And slowly, the mocking whispers gave way to cautious curiosity. She never asked for help, someone noted. She just keeps going. One day, a woman who had mocked her at the well watched Ebra sing softly to one baby while bathing the other, and whispered to her neighbor, "That woman, she gets something inside her." But Ebra didn't notice. Her focus was on the two lives sleeping beside her, lives the world had tossed away, but she had chosen to protect. And in that choice, she was beginning to discover a power within herself that no insult could shatter. Naming the babies was the first real act of motherhood Ebra allowed herself to celebrate. She whispered their names over and over, Chisholm, Chinaza, not just as titles, but as prayers. She sang them into existence like lullabies. When Chisholm coughed in the middle of the night, Ebra rubbed her chest with palm oil and murmured Igbo hymns her mother once used. When Chinaza had a rash, she boiled bitter leaf and bathed her carefully, checking every inch of her fragile skin. Every scream, every sigh, every yawn was noted with the precision of a woman who loved fiercely. She no longer saw herself as barren. Her arms were full. Her breasts didn't flow with milk, but her soul overflowed with a maternal grace that shocked even her. And in that tiny, cracked room, where only ghosts used to live, the sound of babies laughing began to echo. Of course, the struggles didn't fade. They grew heavier with time. Chisholm was more restless, cried longer, and ate more. Chinaza was quiet but prone to fevers. Ebra ran back and forth between doing odd jobs and caring for them. Sometimes she carried one on her back and the other in front. The strain hurt her waist, but she bore it. She sold off her last necklace, her late mother's chain, to buy baby powder and mosquito nets. When people asked why she was killing herself for babies who weren't hers, she answered with calm eyes, "They're mine now." Blood didn't matter. Bond did. These girls had come to her the way grace comes, undeserved, unexpected, and undeniable. She began to speak of our home, our future, and our life, no longer living for herself, but for something greater. Two helpless souls who had reminded her that she still had something to give. One morning, as the sun crept through the window, Ebra watched the twins sleeping beside her, their chests rising in rhythm. For the first time in years, she smiled without forcing it. She gently reached out and touched their tiny fingers, amazed by how perfectly they fit around hers. In their eyes, when they opened them, she saw no judgment, no questions, only trust. Pure, innocent trust. And in that moment, she made a silent vow. I will protect you. I will fight for you. I will starve for you, if I must. But you will never feel the pain I felt. It was not a vow made from desperation, but from love, the kind that can't be bought, faked, or broken. The kind that comes not from birthing a child, but from choosing to stay when no one else does. Rainfall became a blessing and a burden. When clouds gathered, Ebra rushed outside with rusted pans, cracked basins, and old buckets she'd salvaged from nearby compounds. The rain was her water supply, her sanitation, her everything. On dry days, she fetched water from a distant stream, with one baby on her back and the other tied across her chest. Her body bore the toll of the miles, the heat, and the constant weight of two growing children, but she never complained. She collected rainwater not just for bathing and cooking, but to prepare pap when powdered milk finished. There were nights the twins cried for hours, their stomachs refusing the thin pap, but Ebra sat by them patiently, rocking them, whispering softly, and wiping tears, theirs and hers. The firewood smoke choked her small room, and her eyes burned constantly, but she endured it because her babies had warmth, food, and arms that held them. The hunger gnawed like a wild animal. She often chewed dry Gary soaked in water and called it rice, so the twins wouldn't grow up with a sense of lack. At times, she boiled unripe plantain peels with salt to simulate soup. She told herself stories at night, stories of the future where the girls would be doctors, singers, anything something. When there was no money, she went to the roadside, picking grains of rice that spilled from careless traders. She would wash them, pick out the stones, and make a meal of it. And when even that failed, she prayed. Not the loud, dramatic prayers people screamed in church, but the kind whispered into her pillow, muffled by the cries of the babies she loved. God, help me see another day, she would say. Not for me, for them. And somehow, a neighbor would knock with leftover stew, or an old classmate would pass and give her 50 naira. It was never enough, but it was never nothing. Despite everything, the bond between Ebra and the twins grew fierce. Chisholm began to recognize her voice, and Chinaza always smiled when Ebra returned from the market. That recognition, that tiny, fragile acknowledgement, gave her the strength of 100 warriors. When people mocked her and called her foolish, she would remember the way Chisholm reached for her hand, or how Chinaza laughed when she sang. One afternoon, while bathing them by the stream, another woman said, "You day suffer for Pekin, way no know your blood." Ebra didn't argue. She just said, "Love is stronger than blood." The woman laughed, but Ebra wasn't speaking for her. She was speaking for herself, and for the future she refused to give up on. The twins may not have come from her womb, but they had come into her heart, and she would fight with every breath to raise them into women the world would never forget. Years passed, and the babies grew. The little girls, who once fit into baskets now ran barefoot through the compound, their laughter ringing like music across the dusty yard. Ebra had taught them to speak with kindness, to pray before eating, and to always respect others, even those who laughed at them. But with growth came new battles. The time had come for school, and Ebra, with barely enough to feed them, faced an impossible mountain. School uniforms, books, fees, all danced before her like mocking shadows. Yet she was determined. She went to the village school and knelt before the headmaster, explaining her story in tears. The man looked at her, surprised, and said, "I know those girls. They're smart. Let them come. We'll find a way." He waived the fees for the first term, but the rest was up to her. Ebra worked harder than she ever had. She woke before dawn, washed 5 buckets of clothes for different households, and still found time to cook for the girls, braid their hair, and escort them to school. She stitched their uniforms by hand using second-hand fabric and cut sandals out of old leather. But those sandals didn't last. The girls often walked barefoot, their soles cracked and bruised. One day, Chinaza returned home with a cut on her heel. Ebra wept that night, feeling like she had failed. The next morning, she sold her last piece of jewelry, a thin gold earring her mother left behind, and bought them new sandals. "It's just an earring," she whispered to herself, "but they are my daughters." She fed them well that night, hiding her own hunger as always. She told them stories of queens and warriors who rose from nothing. "And that's who you are," she said, "queens in disguise." Despite the hardship, the twins thrived. Chisholm loved numbers and began correcting the teacher's arithmetic. Chinaza wrote poems that made her classmates cry. Their minds were sharp, their hearts kind. Ebra would sit by the school window sometimes, just to watch them from afar. It filled her with something she hadn't felt in years, hope. And the villagers, who once mocked her, began to murmur in surprise. "Those girls are smart," some said, "and they act like proper children." One day, the village chief's wife saw them reciting poems during a community event and asked, "Whose children are those?" Someone whispered, "Ebra's." The woman blinked, stunned. Ebra? Mama nobody. But the name no longer stung. The winds were changing. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably. The day the scholarship letter arrived, Ebra stared at the envelope for minutes before opening it. It was addressed to Chisholm Ebra, and though she knew it wasn't biological truth, the name warmed her. Inside, the letter confirmed that Chisholm had been selected for a government-funded tech initiative in the city, full scholarship, living allowance, mentorship program. Ebra couldn't believe it. She read it over and over, her hands trembling. Then she screamed with joy, spinning Chisholm around in the compound. Chinaza clapped and danced, and even the neighbors peeked over the fence to see what the excitement was about. For a woman who had spent years begging for food, that letter was a prophecy fulfilled. "You're going to the city," she told Chisholm through tears. "You'll see the world beyond this village. You'll shine, my daughter." A week later, something even more surprising happened. A music scout from Onitsha had been traveling through the village and heard Chinaza singing at the community well. He stopped, listened, and recorded her, without her knowing. That video went viral online, and within days he returned with an offer: vocal training, exposure, and a chance to record. Chinaza was speechless. Ebra fell to her knees and cried. Both daughters, the baby she found beside the trash, now had doors opening to dreams she could never afford. But along with joy came fear. Ebra had never let them out of her sight. She feared the city's hunger, its cruelty, its deception. "Will you be safe?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Will you remember who you are?" They both knelt before her and held her hands. "We carry your heart with us, Mama," they said. "Always." The day they left, Ebra packed their wrappers with small handwritten prayers folded into corners. She placed roasted groundnuts and gari in tins, telling them to eat only when they truly needed it. She couldn't give them iPhones or suitcases, but she gave them protection, the kind only love can provide. As the bus pulled away, she stood alone at the park, her scarf flapping in the breeze, her heart heavy with both joy and grief. The babies she'd raised were flying. She walked home slowly, entered the empty compound, and for the first time in years, it was silent. No laughter, no small feet running, just her. She sat on the mat, hugged their pillows, and whispered, "Let the world see what I saw in you," the day everyone else turned away. When the twins left for the city, the silence that filled Mama Ebra's home wasn't just the absence of voices. It was the absence of purpose. The compound, once alive with tiny footsteps, songs, and the smell of burnt plantain, became hauntingly still. Ebra walked around like a woman whose hands had forgotten what to hold. She swept the yard every morning, even though it barely needed cleaning. She fetched water from the well and filled empty buckets that no one would use. She cooked small meals and left half untouched. The lantern she used to light for midnight feedings now burned with no audience. At night, she lay on her mat, staring at the wooden ceiling, whispering names into the dark. Chisholm, Chinaza, the names filled her with pride, but they also tore her apart with longing. The home she had built around love now echoed with its absence. Days turned into weeks, and letters stopped coming. The girls were busy, she told herself. They were chasing dreams. And yet, loneliness sat with her like a shadow that refused to leave. The neighbors still called her Mama Twins with a touch of honor, but no one knew how much she missed the small things, the mismatched slippers left at the door, the half-drawn homework on torn paper, the sound of laughter that healed her heart even when food was scarce. She would sometimes sit on the bench in front of the house and watch other mothers walk their children to school, her heart aching with both memory and gratitude. "I didn't carry them in my womb," she often thought, "but they carried my heart away with them." Still, she never resented the distance. She knew children must outgrow arms that once held them, but she hadn't expected how much it would hurt to let go. One day, she walked to the village cybercafe with a 100 naira note, money she had saved by foregoing pepper in her soup, and asked the attendant to help her write an email to Chisholm. The boy looked amused, but helped. "Tell her I am well," she said, "and that her flowers are still blooming." She wanted to say more, but the emotions caught in her throat. On the way home, a neighbor asked, "You done hear from your daughters?" Ebra smiled and nodded. "Yes, they're fine," she lied. But that night, she lit the lantern and sat by the doorway, waiting for a breeze strong enough to carry her love to the city. Though her body was alone, her soul lived in every step her daughters took. And that was the sacrifice of motherhood, to raise wings strong enough to fly, even if it meant being left behind. In the city, success began to wrap itself around the twins like a second skin. Chisholm was thriving in her tech program, coding solutions, building apps, and catching the attention of her mentors. Chinaza's voice melted hearts in studios, and she was quickly becoming the darling of acoustic music lovers online. Their lives became crowded with new faces, flashing cameras, late-night brainstorming, and shows. Yet in quiet moments, when the applause faded and the city lights dimmed, a question began to creep in. Who are we really? It started when a reporter asked about their biological parents during an interview. Chinaza smiled and said, "Our mother is in the village. Her name is Ebra." But when the video aired, the host captioned it, "Talented twins adopted from the streets." Who were their real parents? That line cut through Chisholm like glass. Not because it diminished Mama Ebra's love, but because it cast a shadow on the only truth they had ever known. They began asking questions. Quietly, gently. At first, it was just curiosity. Chinaza asked, "Why do I have this scar on my wrist? Do you remember how I got it?" Chisholm would shrug. "Maybe from the market days." Mama never said. But soon, the questions grew teeth. "We don't resemble her," Chisholm noted one night, studying an old photo of Ebra. "Our skin tone, our eyes, even our blood types don't match." Chinaza brushed it off, not wanting to unravel the piece they had built. But then, Chisholm came across an old gossip thread online about a prominent politician's alleged scandal years ago. Twin daughters abandoned after birth. The timelines matched. The hospital name matched. Even the vague description of the baby's features seemed eerily familiar. Chisholm showed Chinaza. "Could this be us?" she asked. Chinaza stared at the screen in silence, unsure whether to feel anger or disbelief. The discovery left them shaken. It wasn't just that someone may have given birth to them and thrown them away. It was the reality that someone could have done so despite knowing they were alive. All the affection they had for Mama Ebra now bloomed tenfold. How could someone discard what that woman had nearly died to protect? The girls didn't immediately confront Mama. They didn't even want answers from her. They wanted to find the truth quietly, not to disrupt the love they already had, but to understand the world that had abandoned them. Because even as the world now clapped for them, they were beginning to realize that not everyone who claps wants you to win. But Mama Ebra? She had clapped for them when they had nothing. That truth was all that mattered, even if the shadows of their past were finally beginning to stir. It happened unexpectedly, during a lunch break interview playing on the studio's waiting room television. Chinaza had just finished rehearsals, and while sipping a bottle of water, she turned to the screen and froze. The woman being interviewed had presence, elegant, poised, articulate. Her voice was confident, her gestures refined. She wore a deep green lace gown, had a brooch shaped like a dove on her shoulder, and spoke about empowering young women in politics. But it wasn't her speech that caught Chinaza's attention. It was her face. There on national television was the same woman Chinaza had dreamt of, not once, but several times. The same high cheekbones, the same slant in the eyebrows, the same small dimple that appeared when she smiled. Chinaza leaned closer, heart racing. At the bottom of the screen, the name read, Honorable Ifeoma Nduka, Senator, Chairperson Women and Children Affairs Committee. Chinaza snapped a photo of the screen and sent it to Chisholm instantly. "Look closely," she texted. "Tell me what you see." Minutes later, Chisholm called. "It's her," she whispered. "It's the woman from the article." For the next 2 days, they obsessed over details. They combed the internet for old press releases, magazine covers, and archived interviews. They found a blurry report from 25 years ago, an anonymous hospital staff member's confession about a scandal involving a wealthy political family and abandoned twins. Nothing ever came of it, and the case was buried. But a photo from that year showed Ifeoma walking into the hospital visibly pregnant. Months later, no record of a birth. No baby photos. No public mention. "She gave birth to us," Chisholm concluded, "and she abandoned us." The realization wasn't just shocking, it was nauseating. This woman, celebrated nationwide for her advocacy, had once left 2 newborns to die in a dump. But instead of anger, something else took root. Resolve. Chinaza looked at the video of the interview again and whispered, "The world claps for her, but the real mother, the one they should know, is sitting in a dusty village with a broken lantern and borrowed pots. Chisholm nodded. We need to make this right. Not by exposing that woman. Not yet. But by honoring the one who chose us when no one else did. And so began the quiet plotting of a revelation the world was not ready for. A celebration not of success or talent or fame, but of a forgotten mother who loved when she had nothing, who gave when the world gave her pain, and who deserved to be seen. Chisholm and Chinaza spent days grappling with the storm that had erupted inside their hearts. They now knew with quiet certainty that Madame Ifeoma Nduka, respected senator, philanthropist, and champion of women's rights, was their biological mother. The woman the world admired for giving speeches about protecting children had once discarded her own. And yet, neither Chisholm nor Chinaza felt the urge to expose her. They didn't want fame or scandal. What haunted them most was the quiet pain that Mama Ebra must have buried in order to raise them, the pain of being questioned, mocked, and laughed at for loving children that weren't hers. The pain of hearing whispers about her madness, her uselessness, all while giving everything she had. Ifeoma had given them life, but Ebra had given them everything that made life worth living. They met in Chisholm's apartment late one night to talk about what to do. Chinaza, normally the emotional one, was unusually quiet. She stared at a childhood photo they had framed, a grainy picture of both of them in patched dresses, sitting in front of Ebra's cracked wall, with her arms around them, smiling like she had just won a lottery. She never asked us for anything, Chinaza said, her voice barely a whisper. Not shoes, not phones, not thank yous. Just love. Chisholm nodded, her jaw clenched with emotion. And she gave us that even when the world gave her nothing in return. That night, they decided on a plan not rooted in revenge, but in justice. Not for themselves, but for the woman who raised them, who endured ridicule, starvation, illness, and sleepless nights for children the world thought were worthless. Their plan wasn't simple. It required subtlety, secrecy, and a perfect stage. They didn't want a media circus. They wanted a moment. One unforgettable moment where the world would look into the eyes of their mother and know what real motherhood looked like. Chisholm reached out to a contact from the Ministry of Youth and Innovation. Chinaza spoke with her record label about performing at an upcoming national gala for exceptional young Nigerians. When both were selected as keynote guests, they requested one special accommodation, a private invitation for a woman from Yumu's village. No titles. No last name, just Mama Ebra. The organizers agreed, assuming she was an elderly grandmother. But the twins knew, when the cameras rolled and the lights shone, the world would finally meet the woman behind their success. Not for pity, not for drama, but for truth. The invitation arrived on a bright morning, printed on gold-trimmed card and hand-delivered to Yumu's by a courier who looked very out of place in a dusty village. Mama Ebra was in her backyard peeling cassava when he walked up and said, "Madam, this is for you." She blinked at the envelope like it was a relic from another world. Carefully, she opened it and read, "You are cordially invited to the National Youth Excellence Gala, Abuja." Her hands trembled. She turned the card over several times, confused. "There must be a mistake," she said. "I am not a minister. I don't own a phone. I don't even have a good wrapper to wear there." But in her heart, something stirred. The twins had called the day before and asked if she'd be free to travel. "We just want you close to us, Mama," they said. "Please say yes." Even then, Ebra didn't fully understand. Her neighbors watched with wide eyes as a sleek black car came to pick her days later. She had never sat in a car with air conditioning before. She wore a borrowed lace wrapper and an old pair of brown sandals. Her scarf was freshly ironed, her hands scrubbed clean, and her heart beat like a drum against her ribs. When she arrived at the hotel in Abuja, she walked slowly, unsure of how to move through the marble-floored lobby. But her eyes lit up the moment she saw Chisholm and Chinaza run into her arms. "Mama," they whispered, hugging her tightly. "You look beautiful." Ebra smiled, her eyes misty. "I look like a farmer in a palace," she joked. But deep inside, she was overwhelmed by the love in their gaze, the same gaze she had seen in their eyes since they were babies with nothing. The night of the gala came quickly, As she sat quietly in the crowd, surrounded by lights and music, she felt small but proud. She clapped for every award winner, not realizing that the final spotlight would be hers. When Chinaza took the stage in a flowing red gown and stood before the microphone, the hall grew silent. Then, with a voice that trembled with emotion, she began to sing. The Woman Who Chose Me wasn't just a song, it was a story, a journey, a confession. With each lyric, the room grew stiller. People cried. Some stood. And when Chisholm walked onto the stage with a microphone, her voice steady but thick with tears, the world shifted. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, we were thrown away, as babies, left to die. But one woman, one poor mocked, forgotten woman, picked us up from the dust and gave us her life. That woman is here tonight. For a moment, no one moved. The entire gala, a room filled with dignitaries, celebrities, and politicians, fell into stunned silence. Every camera turned. Every heart held its breath. Then, two spotlights turned toward the middle of the hall. There, seated in a modest gown, with her wrapper folded neatly across her knees and a scarf covering her now gray hair, was Mama Ebra. Her eyes were wide with confusion, her lips parted slightly, unsure if she was dreaming. Chinaza stepped off the stage and walked toward her, microphone still in hand. Please rise, Mama, she said, her voice breaking. Let the world see what love looks like. Ebra stood slowly, her knees shaking, her hands clutched tightly around her wrapper. The applause started quietly, a few claps here and there, but then it roared to life like thunder. People rose to their feet. Some cried openly. Some bowed their heads. Chisholm descended from the stage and took her mother's other hand. Together, they led her forward, toward the stage, toward the lights, toward the truth. Ebra moved like someone caught between worlds. She reached the stage and was handed the microphone. I don't know what to say, she whispered. I am just a woman. I only did what a mother should do. But that simple statement shattered the room. One journalist later wrote, she redefined motherhood in 10 words. The president's wife stood and applauded. A representative from the Ministry of Women Affairs stepped up and declared that Mama Ebra would receive a National Medal of Motherhood, the first ever in Nigeria. But Ebra didn't hear most of it. She was still staring at her daughters, eyes filled with tears, lips trembling. You remember me, she said. You didn't forget. Chinaza held her tighter. How could we ever forget the woman who taught us how to live? Behind the cameras, someone tried to reach Senator Ifeoma. Rumors spread quickly about the mysterious twins, the unspoken scandal, the resemblance. But by then, the world's attention had already shifted. Not to the woman who hid her shame, but to the woman who embraced it. That night, thousands of people searched for Mama Ebra online. Social media erupted. Artists painted her face. The schools asked for her story to be added to curriculum. And in a small, humble room in Abuja, away from all the noise, Ebra sat with her daughters and ate roasted yam and palm oil with her hands. No gold, no banquet, just warmth, just love, just the daughters she had raised. The morning after the gala, the name Mama Ebra was on every tongue, in homes, schools, offices, and television screens across the country. Her image, captured as she stood between Chisholm and Chinaza with tears running down her cheeks, became an emblem of true motherhood. Journalists flooded her village. Reporters came knocking on mud-plastered walls that had never seen electricity. But the woman they hoped to find giving fiery interviews was the same soft-spoken, humble widow who had once begged for pap to feed the babies she found. When asked how she felt, Ebra smiled and said, God remembered me. That is enough. The world had called her mad for choosing children no one wanted. Now, the same world called her Mama of the Nation. And yet, through all the praise, she remained rooted. She still swept her yard at dawn and still prayed over her daughters' names each night. In Yumuz, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The same villagers who had laughed at her, who whispered behind her back and crossed the street to avoid her children, were now falling over themselves with apologies. Women brought wrappers. Men offered yams. Even the pastor, who once ignored her presence in church, begged her to lead a prayer one Sunday. But Mama Ebra didn't gloat. She didn't mention the ridicule or the years of starvation. She simply smiled and said, "It's not me you should apologize to. It's the future mothers watching you." Her humility struck a chord. The chief of the village honored her publicly, gifting her a plot of land near the town square. The government stepped in too, announcing that a new maternity center would be built in her name, the Ebra Center for Abandoned Children. Ebra wept when she heard the news, not because of the title, but because it meant no child would ever be thrown away like hers were. Somewhere far away, in an upscale government building, Senator Ifioma watched it all unfold on a muted television. Her face was tense, her fingers trembling as she traced the outline of the twins in the screen. She never reached out, never admitted the truth. Perhaps she couldn't. Perhaps shame held her in a prison no one else could see. But it no longer mattered. The story had moved on without her. What the nation saw now was not her sin, but Ebra's salvation. And in that small compound in Yumuz, Mama Ebra sat under the shade of a mango tree, flanked by two young women who once fit in her arms. As they held her hands and rested their heads on her shoulders, she finally understood what her mother had once told her in a dream long ago. A good mother is not one who gives birth. It's the one who never walks away. Months passed, but the glow of that night never faded. The world moved on, as it always does, but something had shifted permanently. Chisholm and Chinaza became household names not just for their talents, but for the story behind them. They rejected offers from media houses seeking to expose Senator Ifeoma's secret. "This is not about who birthed us," Chisholm told a journalist. "It's about who raised us." Together, the twins began building something greater than their individual dreams, a legacy rooted in love. They formed the Daughters Foundation, an organization that supported abandoned children, single mothers, and women who had been mocked like Mama Ebra once was. Their first project was in Yumuz, where a large, beautiful building rose from the soil, where shame once grew. Painted in soft yellow and white, with flowers planted by schoolchildren, the plaque at the front read, "In honor of the woman who chose us, Mama Ebra." Ebra never became a politician, nor did she ever wear flashy clothes. But people from around the world came to shake her hand. She would greet them barefoot, sometimes with palm oil stains on her wrapper, and say, "You're welcome." The mothers she had once swept floors for now brought their daughters to her for blessings. She became a symbol, not of perfection, but of perseverance. Her compound, once cracked and crumbling, was now restored, but her favorite place remained a wooden stool under the mango tree. There, she told stories to young children who called her Mama Ebra with love and awe. She reminded them that value doesn't come from where you start, but from who you choose to love. And when people asked what gave her strength, she would smile and point to the distance, where the twins' voices echoed with laughter and music, and say, "I saw treasure in what the world called trash." On the day the center officially opened, the twins stood beside her before a crowd of dignitaries, village chiefs, students, and mothers. As they handed her a golden key, symbolic of the life she had unlocked, the national anthem played softly in the background. But it wasn't the flag that made people cry. It was the way Mama Ebra held the key to her heart and said, "I lost everything once. My name, my home, my dignity. But I gained two daughters who made the world call me blessed." The crowd erupted into applause. Tears ran freely. And in that moment, under a wide Nigerian sky, where dust once covered her feet and laughter once mocked her name, Mama Ebra stood as proof that love, quiet, steady, unconditional love, is the greatest redemption of all. She had raised daughters the world would never forget, because she had first dared to love what no one else wanted. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.